Class by reading this classic milestone essay by Peter Singer from the early 70s called Famine, Affluence, and Morality. It is an essay with a very simple argument that Singer thinks has momentous consequences if that argument is taken seriously. It is a simple argument, and that could either be a virtue or a vice. If an argument is simple, it's easy to understand. It may be more powerful, but some would say it's too simple. There have been criticisms of this argument that say that Singer was reducing things to principles that were too simple, but that's for you to decide. So, what is this simple argument after an introduction about a contemporary humanitarian crisis from the early 70s? Singer gets to his argument, and again, just so we know what his ambitions are, he tells us what he thinks the consequences of this argument should be, practical consequences. He says, what are the moral implications of a situation like this? In what follows, I shall argue that the way people in relatively affluent countries react to a situation like that in Bengal cannot be justified. Indeed, the whole way we look at moral issues, our moral conceptual scheme, needs to be altered, and with it, the way of life that has come to be taken for granted in our society. Now, the our is the society of the affluent countries, the Western countries, essentially, some Asian countries too that are quite affluent now. So Singer thinks that his simple argument could have revolutionary consequences if it was taken seriously, and we'll have to see why. So, what is that argument? It has two principles, assumptions, premises that Singer offers. And he basically says, he doesn't argue for them. He says that if you share these principles, then you have to come along with me in terms of the revolution and the way that we live. If you don't accept the principles, then you just don't accept the principles. But the question is, are these principles that he offers, these premises or assumptions, are they compelling or not? The first is, he says, I begin with the assumption that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. And he immediately says, I think most people will agree about this. And I think that he's right. These are bad things. Suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad things. I think that he's right. They are bad things. The second principle is the one that sort of gets things going and is more controversial, but also has a lot of appeal. He says, my next point is this: if it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening, without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought, morally, to do it. And that also sounds compelling. Maybe it's not quite as obvious as the first one, quite as compelling as the first one. It does seem to be saying if we can prevent something bad from happening, we should. And the condition here, the qualification is if we can prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. Do we accept that as a principle? Well, Singer thinks we should. He says this principle seems almost as uncontroversial as the last one. And he gives us a sense of what comparable moral importance would be. He says, by without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, I mean without causing anything else comparably bad to happen, or doing something that is wrong in itself, or failing to promote some moral good comparable insignificance to the bad thing that we can prevent. That is, we all think that we should prevent bad things from happening, but the question is, how much do we think it's reasonable to sacrifice in order to prevent those bads from happening? Singer sets a kind of a limit to that. Well, without sacrifice anything of comparable importance. So, for instance, I, generally speaking, have a duty to prevent somebody dying if it's in my power to prevent their death. But it would be unreasonable to say that I would have to sacrifice my own life to prevent their death. I may choose to do that, but I wouldn't be said that it couldn't be said that I ought to do it. because my life is obviously of comparable moral importance to the other's life. It may be also that there are other things that may be of comparable moral importance that I can't be reasonably expected to sacrifice, my health or my body, the integrity of my body, or if I had to undergo some horrible suffering. It may be said that those things are also of comparable moral importance, and I can't be reasonably required to make those sacrifices in order to save somebody's life. In any case, it's a judgment call, which Singer is perfectly aware of, but he thinks that we have the capacity to roughly make these sort of judgments. So these are the two principles that he says would completely revolutionize our way of life. And it's following the second principle that does so, because we should be willing then to sacrifice, whatever we have that's not of comparable moral importance to prevent the bads from happening. Specific bads he's thinking of are the kind of bads that happen during famine and war. If we could give to a reputable charity to prevent those bads from happening, to feed those people or give them access to clean water and medical care, on the second premise, it would seem that we'd have to do it. So then the question is really, how much would we need to give up? Um, and that's a big part of this essay, and it's something that he addresses towards the end. Excuse me. Let's see if I can find it. This is towards the end of the essay, where he says a third point raised by the conclusion reached earlier relates to the question of just how much we all ought to be giving away. That is, what is this comparable moral importance qualification? He says one possibility, which has already been mentioned, is that we ought to give until we reach the level of marginal utility, that is, the level at which by giving more, I would cause as much suffering to myself or my dependents as I would relieve by my gift. This would mean, of course, that one would reduce oneself to very near the material circumstances of a Bengali refugee. So, to reach the level of comparable moral importance for Singer would mean that you give away your extras to the point where if you gave any more, you would be reducing yourself to the level of the person you were trying to help. That would be one way of setting the limit in how much to give. But he thinks maybe that's, well, what does he think of that? What he says next is important. He says, it will be recalled that earlier I put forward both a strong and a moderate version of the principle of preventing bad occurrences. The strong version, which required us to prevent bad things from happening, unless in doing so we would be sacrificing something of comparable moral significance, does seem to require reducing ourselves to a level of marginal utility. That is, yeah, if you followed the principle in its strong version, you would give and give until the point where by giving any more, you reach the point of diminishing returns, and you'd be reducing yourself to the level of the person you're trying to help. And he says, I should also say that the strong version seems to me to be the correct one. But then he says, I proposed the more moderate version, that we should prevent bad occurrences, unless to do so we had to sacrifice something morally significant, only in order to show that even on this surely undeniable principle, great change in our way of life is required. That is, the more moderate principle, and this would be the second principle of his argument, would not be that we should give to the point where we are sacrificing something of comparable moral importance. We should only give to the point where would sacrifice something of any moral importance. And this would be much less demanding. It would mean, essentially, if you had to give up going to the movies to save somebody's life, you should do it. If you had to give up going out to restaurants in order to make sure that somebody could eat, you should do it. If you had to give up buying new clothes just for the sake of looking good so that you could give somebody access to clean water, you should do it. So even on this more moderate interpretation of the second principle, and it is the second principle of the argument he's talking about, It still, he says, would be, it may not be the correct version. He still thinks the more demanding version is the correct version, but it would still be revolutionary because we would all, in the affluent countries, be giving a heck of a lot more to charity if we followed that principle.